Hey guys, so today we're going to be talking about all the things that led up to the American Revolution. We are recapping a little bit about the French and Indian War that ended in 1763, all the way up until Lexington and Concord, and the shot heard around the world, the first battles of the Revolution. So let's take a glance at how American colonists viewed themselves before the Revolution. So essentially, in 18th century British colonies, they were proud to belong to the British, to England, to Great Britain. They maintained their accent, their culture, their language, their religion, and their ties to Great Britain as well. So it was a gradual progression. It wasn't a we are British, now we are not British. And we're going to be talking about that gradual progression as we go. But keep in mind throughout this that many colonists viewed themselves as Englishmen, and it was good to be an Englishman because at this time Great Britain gave rights to people, and they had a pseudo-representative democracy, not democracy, representative government that a lot of other countries didn't have. And also, living in the colonies, if you were a middle to lower class citizen, you had a much higher standard of living. There's land for the grabbing in the colonies. There's open air. There's more markets. There's a diversified diet. So there's a higher standard of living and a lower mortality rate in the colonies. Now, we'll see a lot of elite and upper class not want to make the move to the colonies because they're doing well in England. But if you were poor or crowded out of your land, then going to the colonies was a great deal. So essentially up until the point of the French and Indian War, with a few exceptions that we're going to talk about, the colonies are living under a period of salutary neglect. And salutary neglect is the idea that if the mother country, England, leaves the colonies alone to fend for themselves, then the colonies will prosper, and in turn the mother country, England, will prosper. So at the end of King George's War and Queen Anne's War, we're going to see in the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, the British government go through a period of salutary neglect with the colonies. They're going to enjoy freedom. They're going to have less economic interference. And Great Britain's job is to provide the things that you see on your screen, to provide protection, a standing army, to give them people that are coming to the colonies through immigration to advertise, hey, move to the colonies, you can have all these rights. And essentially the significance of one second. So one other reason that Great Britain kind of treats the colonies as like, oh, just do whatever you want at this point, just make sure that you're listening to us every once in a while, is that Great Britain is fighting a lot of wars in Europe, especially the 7 Years' War, which we know as the French and Indian War, is raging in Europe. And so they have a lot to deal with over there, and not a lot of efforts and resources to put forth to controlling the colonies. So from this, the significance of all of this is the colonies are left alone. They had to be self-reliant. They had to learn how to organize. And from this, we're going to get 13 separate colonies, 13 separate colonial assemblies that are all still loyal to the king, but still that have some sort of home rule. They get used to regulating their own affairs without significant interference. Their manufacturing increases because they're not being forced to buy things from Great Britain. And essentially the reason that this works is because local government, that last bullet, responds to local needs a lot better. So Parliament over across the pond, across the Atlantic Ocean, they don't really know what's going on in the colonies as much as the elected representative bodies of colonial assemblies. So another thing that's going on in Great Britain at this time, to understand this period of we are British evolving into what we want to break away from the British, is the Whig Party. Now, there is a Whig Party in American history in the early 1800s, first half of that century, but we are going to be talking about the Whig Party in Great Britain first. And here's the ideology of the Whig Party, that concentrated power becomes tyranny, and they see that in the king. They see that in King George. And they want to institute better reforms so that the power of the king can be checked by Parliament. They're not instituting overthrowing the whole system. They're not instituting the colonies breaking away. They're not even really there for the colonies. It's a political party that's evolving in England itself. But from this ideology of the representative body needs to actually represent who they're supposed to be representing, their constituents, and the king's power needs to be checked by Parliament, we get these ideas that will spread to the colonies. So Whig ideology will start to influence revolutionary ideas. All right, so just a little bit review of some violent protests that just foreshadow the violence of the Revolutionary War and the reasons behind it. We've already talked about two of these, and they were in your Henrietta last unit as well. The first one is the Regulator Movement. Actually, I'm going to talk about Paxton Boys first. Sorry, it's at the bottom of the screen. We're going to talk about it first. Paxton Boys is in 1764, right after the Proclamation of 1763, after the French and Indian War. The proclamation line said, "Do not move past the Appalachian Mountains. It's for your protection against the natives." Well, people in Pennsylvania, Scots, Irish, remember they're uprooted from Scotland, then uprooted from Ireland. They came to the New World, and it's not great for them either because they're still really poor. They're upset because they want to move out west, and they continue to ignore the proclamation line of 1763. But they keep getting into trouble with natives. And they're not a fan of Pennsylvania, where they live with Quakers, because Quakers are pacifists and have great trade relations and great peace relations with the natives. So essentially, this group of poor, angry white farmers who just never get a good deal, and now are told that they can't even move out west, and Great Britain's not going to protect them past that proclamation line, they react and they come together. They will end up massacring, scalping 20 Indians, taking those scalps into Philadelphia and causing a riot. Eventually, it will die down and they'll be stopped by a volunteer militia, but it just foreshadows angry, regular people demanding more representation. That's an idea that's going to carry into the Revolutionary War. Next one is the Regulator Movement, 1771, even getting closer and closer to the Revolutionary period. This is in North Carolina. It actually lasts 3 years. The Regulators are not like a riot party at first. They're more like a group of people that come together for collective security. They're poor white farmers that want to move west, just like Paxton Boys. And they're upset because the rich planters more towards the east and the people in towns, the merchants more towards the east, are not really representing them in Congress, taking them to court for debts and payments that need to be paid and taxes. And so essentially, a lot of Western poor farmers will join this regulator party, this defense party, and they'll start rioting. And essentially, this lasts for 3 years in North Carolina. There's a point of terror for many of those living in Western North Carolina and in the cities in the east. And a colonial militia will defeat the Regulators at this huge, massive battle where over 4,000 men are involved. But again, it's just foreshadowing we are upset because we have a lack of representation, and that's going to lead into revolutionary ideas. All right, so mercantilism. In a nutshell, mercantilism is the idea that colonies exist for the benefit of the mother country. It is the exact opposite of salutary neglect. Essentially, the idea behind mercantilism is colonies need to add to the empire's wealth, prosperity, and sufficiency. They are renting their land. They are tenants. So they're expected to grow tobacco. They're expected to grow cash crops without troubling the colonial administration, without troubling the king, and to sell it for profit and therefore profit for the mother country. They are expected to, be nice to the British Navy and Army that are going to be standing in the colonies after the French and Indian War. They're expected to supply them with the ships, with the things that you need on ships, with naval stores, with trade, to prosper the British Navy and Army. They're expected to buy British goods, provide a market for British goods. They're also expected to try and keep gold within the empire by trading with British traders, by only trading with other traders for actual gold and silver instead of paper currency. So that's the overall ideology of mercantilism. And there are 2 points that we're going to talk about before the French and Indian War where Great Britain tries to implement this system in the New World and it is largely ignored by the colonists. So let's talk about the first time they try. These are the navigation laws, and if you will, I didn't put it on the slide, will you put like 1650s era, very early in colonization. The purpose of the navigation laws is to try out a mercantilist system and to beat out Britain's competition in the New World. We're trading, colonists were trading with the Dutch and the French and the Spanish, and Great Britain was like, no, hello, you're in the New World to benefit me. So the idea behind the navigation laws is all goods, raw materials, and some light manufacturing goods that are being made in the colonies must be traded and shipped on British or American ships. And there were certain enumerated articles, that means like goods that are in high demand, like tobacco, that weren't allowed to be shipped to any other foreign market except England. And here's what England would do. They would take all of the New World's tobacco and sell it at a higher price to benefit themselves, like buy it from the colonies and then sell it for more. If the colonists, this third bullet right here, if the colonists were buying something from Europe or trading something from Europe, it had to be sent through English ports in Europe or through English ports in the colonies to be taxed. There were also restrictions on what could be sold because Great Britain didn't want to have to compete with colonial merchants. So woolen cloths, beaver caps, any other type of fur trade, or manufactured iron could not be exported from the colonies. It had to be sold to a British person or a British trader who would then take it to England and sell it for a higher price. So that's the navigation laws. Essentially, though, they will be largely ignored by colonists, and they will inspire a lot of smuggling. So think like in your mind, put a picture of a ship, and it's got like a floor with like a secret trapdoor or something like that. And you could open the trapdoor, and there's a bunch of smuggled goods, or barrels that you say one thing is in them, but another thing is in them, like those sort of smuggling tactics. Okay. The next time they will try and institute a type of mercantilism is in 1733. Remember the triangle trade idea where the colonies were trying to kind of kick Great Britain out of the system. Sorry, my dog's barking downstairs. Trying to kick Great Britain out of the system by circumventing their involvement. So the colonies would trade lumber and raw materials to the French Caribbean and West Indies for rum or molasses, molasses that would be made into rum in the colonies. They would trade back with the French West Indies to get slaves from Africa, just trying to circumvent Great Britain's involvement in triangle trade. Great Britain finds out about it, and here's the idea. Molasses Act. Super heavy taxes on molasses, rum, and sugar imported from the French Caribbean. And that's because the colonists loved to trade with the French West Indies. They got slaves from them, they got sugar from them that they made into molasses, and molasses into rum, which was a super high in demand item everywhere in the world. And New England merchants Southern merchants heavily depended on the slave trade. So the molasses tax will impact that as well. Again, largely ignored because of the idea of, oh, well, we can just smuggle it in. So looking at the mercantilist system as they have tried it thus far with the navigation laws and the Molasses Act, we haven't gotten to the heavy taxation that we all know causes the revolution here. Essentially for Great Britain, Essentially for Great Britain and for the colonies, it's not really that much of a burden, largely because they ignore it. And being within the British colony gives them the rights of Englishmen, which is right to representation and unusual opportunities for self-government. Yeah, Parliament's over there, but we can also have something over here. That is unheard of. They enjoy the idea of military protection for free. They're not paying that many taxes for the fact that they are being protected from the natives and from French, Dutch, and Spanish traders from the British military that sends standing troops in the colonies. And finally, they're going to make money from it. Regardless of how much Britain is taxing and regulating things, they're going to make money. But we're going to see when they start this mercantilist system again in 1763 after the French Indian War, colonists will mostly see the negatives of it on the right here. Their economy will be stagnated. It will not develop as quickly as they wanted it to, especially manufacturing, because Great Britain's going to get most of their raw goods. The South is definitely going to suffer. They're going to hit hard because prices of their exports are going to drop. For example, tobacco, they could sell for super top dollar to the French, Dutch, and Spanish, but no, they have to sell it to England, who will then turn around and sell it to the French, Dutch, and Spanish, and they'll make most of the profit. And finally, what really angers them is the idea of writs of assistance. These are search warrants used by British customs officers at trading ports to allow them to harass the colonists into paying their taxes, and the idea is to reduce smuggling. So mostly they're going to see the negatives in the mercantilist system, especially after the French and Indian War. So 1763, when the French and Indian War ends, it's a bad year for the colonists, and we're about to learn why. Essentially, it's going to mark a new era between British and colonist relations. The idea is the French and Indian War just ended, and England spent a lot of money paying for colonist protection. Who's going to pay for that? We get a new prime minister. I say prime minister lightly because, like, how much power do they really have when there's a king? That's the idea. But him and the king are pretty chummy with each other, and he's going to get the idea, well, we have these navigation laws in place, and the colonists, all they do is ignore them. Why don't we enforce them? And this is going to start the period of mercantilism that is going to last all the way up until England loses the colonists and the colonists break away and form the United States of America. He also will institute something that's already been happening but essentially makes it worse, is the idea of admiralty courts. On your Quizlet, it's called vice admiralty courts. And these are courts that try smugglers, custom evaders, ship owners, traders, anyone accused of violating commercial mercantilist restrictions, and they're put on trial in front of one British judge and no jury. So essentially, they're going to be guilty. And George Grenville is going to enact those courts again. King George III is totally on his side, the Prime Minister George Grenville's side. He's extremely stubborn. He surrounds himself with yes men that say, yes, King, yes, we'll do what you say. And he's essentially inexperienced with economic policy, and thus will give a lot of power to the Prime Minister. Except there's going to be a lot of different prime ministers during his tenure, during the first 10 years of his reign, but they're all going to go through with this mercantilist economic idea, and he super does not like the Whig power. We've had 50 years of Whigs in power in Parliament, and he does not like the idea that the Whigs are trying to check the power of the king and thus will get rid of them in Parliament, dissolve those houses. So we know the Proclamation Line of 1763 puts a line through the Appalachian Mountains in the New World that prohibits colonists to move west of the Appalachian Mountains. And the idea, again, is to settle land disputes with natives and to prevent more bloody episodes like Pontiac's Rebellion, like issues with the Paxton Boys. To prevent those sort of things, reorganize that area and then eventually open it up to colonist settlement. But the issue is colonists see it as, excuse me, we fought for this land, especially French and Indian War vets. Why aren't we allowed to live on it? And that's the colonist view of the Proclamation Line. All right, so they don't stop with the Proclamation Line of 1763. They hit the colonies hard, right where it hurts in their economy. So the Currency Act of 1764 is Great Britain restricting the colonies printing their own money and instead requiring the colonies pay Great Britain pay back their debts and their taxes with hard currency, so gold and silver, no paper money. Essentially, it really, really hit the colonies hard. Here's why. Mostly the colonies are buying more from England than England is hold on, let me reword this. There's a trade deficit. Most gold and silver will flow back to England from the colonies since colonies will buy more than they are selling to England. There we go. So all this gold and silver is going to be flowing back to Great Britain, which is exactly what they want. But here's the side effect of it. In the colonies, with the lack of gold and silver and this restriction that they can't print any more paper money and use it, we're going to see more bartering, more smuggling, and more trade going on. Again, adding to this idea of we're self-sufficient, we can get along without Great Britain. Look, they've taken all our currency and we're still doing just fine. Next is the Sugar Act in the same year. Essentially, it's like revamping the Molasses Act, and it is aimed specifically to raise revenue for the king. It's not to regulate trade because they're trying to be mean. They literally want to make more money. King George III wants to make more money for himself. So, again, it's regulating the illegal triangle trade where they're trying to break out, get away from Great Britain being involved. It reduces taxes on molasses, but it institutes a tax on absolutely all molasses, not just from the French West Indies. It's not enforced effectively, and eventually those taxes will be lowered, but the fact that it's there to begin with will start to anger the colonies. And finally, the Quartering Act of 1765, certain colonies were required to provide food and quarters or living spaces for British soldiers. And the colonial idea is like, excuse me, we don't have a war going on here. Why do we need these soldiers here? And why are we being forced to pay for them and pay for their living and their expenses? And this actually is going to be a direct lead into our Bill of Rights that says that we don't have to quarter soldiers, which in our mind is like, what does that even mean? But to them, it was very, very important. So the next 3 acts instituted by the English Parliament are going to be kind of the nail in the coffin of those revolutionaries that are thinking we can do without Great Britain. And those are the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, I'm going to say Townsend, and the Tea Act. So let's get started with the Stamp Act here. So the purpose of the Stamp Act, this is 1765, is perhaps one of the most single important events leading up to the Revolution, and here's why. It is meant to raise money to support the new military force in the colonies. And the colonists are like, but we don't want them here. And we definitely don't want to have to pay for them to be here. So here are the provisions of the Stamp Act. You had to use stamped paper or affix a stamp to a paper certifying that you had paid for it. This tax applied to all published materials and legal documents. Here's some examples. Pamphlets, newspapers, diplomas, bills, marriage certificates, death certificates, deeds, leases, mortgages, insurance policies, bonds, ship documents, charters, liquor licenses, playing cards, anything that is something that you buy or something that is a legal document had to have a 3-pence tax on it. So just compare it to like 3 pennies. If I charged you 3 pennies for every piece of paper I gave you in school, I would be a millionaire by the end of the year because I print off a lot of things for you guys. But that's bad in itself to the colonists, but here's what makes it worse. The idea of vice admiralty courts. If you broke the Sugar Act or Stamp Act provisions, the offenders were tried in admiralty courts. Remember, juries are not allowed, meaning that the burden of proof is on the defendant themselves. They have to prove that they were innocent. And the idea of these vice admiralty courts is not like our courts, innocent until proven guilty. Oh no, it's the other way. Guilty until proven innocent. And you have no defender for yourself. You have no jury, and you have no colonists in there defending you. It is a British official judge. So the British view, like Prime Minister Grenville's view, is that the Stamp Act was reasonable and just. Essentially, it only required the colonists to pay for a fair share of their defense, and the Stamp Act had already been in place in Great Britain for 2 generations now, and British people in England hadn't complained about it. But the colonist view of this breaks down into a lot of separate ideas: legislation versus taxation, external taxes and internal taxes, virtual representation, and direct representation. So let's break those down. So here's a little picture of what the stamps would look like. Picture A there is like if you bought a lot of stamps and then you could like tape it or wax it onto a piece of paper. And picture B is like a close-up of what those pence tax would look like, okay? All right, so the colonist view here, legislation and taxation. They agreed that Parliament had the right to impose laws on the colonies. They said, yes, we are part of the British Empire. British Empire has Parliament. You can impose laws on the colonies. But their idea of taxation was different. Their idea of taxation was we have local needs and our local governments are here to respond to those needs. And those needs need to be met by taxes. And thus our local governments need to raise money for necessary things in our town, in our colony, in our village, in our city. So that's problem 1 with their idea of the Stamp Act. Problem 2 is the idea of internal versus external taxes. Internal taxes, I'll start with external on the left. External taxes, the colonists were not upset with the idea of taxation in general. They're upset with the idea that they were taxing things within the colonies. External taxes would be taxing things that come through Europe to the colonies or are traded from the colonies to Europe. Taxing those things is fine to them. Internal taxes, on the other hand, is taxing things within their colonies, like paper. like molasses being traded within a city in the colonies. So internally, they thought that that Parliament, who's across the ocean, shouldn't be able to tax trade within the colonies, just imports and exports. And again, the idea of taxation should be a local idea, that our colonial government should have the right to tax. So George Grenville's response to this would have been, well, you are virtually represented in Parliament. You're a British subject, and because you're British, there are British people in Parliament representing you. But the colonists are like, oh no, we didn't elect those people. Those people are elected by districts within England, within the British Isles. And colonists believed that virtual representation was not adequate or justified, and that's the idea of no taxation without representation that we're going to hear in the Revolutionary War. But they really don't want direct representation either, and that's like they actually vote on colonists, and the colonists go over there and serve in Parliament. And because that would mean that Great Britain had the right to be like, oh, well, your dude was here in Parliament when we were talking about it, and we voted on raising taxes. So they could increase taxes as they have in Great Britain, who has had the stamp tax for 100 years already. It would mean that they have more responsibility to be loyal to the crown. It would mean that their colonial assemblies would have less power. It would mean that the colonial representatives that are sent to serve in British Parliament would be heavily outnumbered by those voted for in England and representing those England districts. So it's kind of like we don't want to be virtually represented, but we don't really want to be directly represented. We just kind of want you to leave us alone like you did previously. And we're going to see that is definitely not what happens. So a few colonists speak out against the Stamp Act of 1765. One of those colonists is Patrick Henry. He's give me liberty or give me death guy. And he will go to the House of Burgesses and write the Virginia Resolve. And essentially, in this paper, in this document, he is claiming that the Stamp Act is an attack on the rights of British colonists because they are Englishmen just living in a different area. And those resolutions, 5 out of the 7 of them that he has written, are adopted by the House of Burgesses, sent to Parliament, and essentially the idea is we will resist this. We will not import your goods anymore. We will fight back against the Stamp Act. And this is where we first get the idea of no taxation with representation. And Patrick Henry in the Virginia Resolves claims that Virginia can only tax Virginians. So Virginians can be taxed, but only by the Virginia House of Burgesses, their colonial assemblies. And the Virginia Resolves is just one of 9 different bills, resolves, government documents that say we're going to resist the Stamp Act throughout the colonies. The Stamp Act is going to be met with more resistance, including the Stamp Act Congress. So the Stamp Act Congress is Massachusetts made an initiative for colonies who adopt the Virginia Resolves or other things like the Virginia Resolves to come together and talk about it as a group of colonies. And so they write a Stamp Act Congress document, which is just a statement of their rights, their grievances, and they demand that the King and Parliament rescind or take back the Stamp Act. In England, essentially the King and Parliament is going to ignore it, and in the colonies, they know that that's going to happen. But what comes from this meeting that's important is the idea of non-importation, which is boycotting buying British stuff, boycotting trading with British people, which would be non-exportation as well. And they'll talk about it and kind of institute it within their colonies, but not officially. The significance of the Stamp Act Congress is we're bringing together 27 different colonial delegates from 9 different colonies. A lot of rival colonies and people with sectional suspicions, like the North is suspicious of the South and the South is suspicious of the Middle. We're breaking down those barriers and setting a precedent to further resistance, saying, okay, when we don't like what Great Britain's doing, we can just come together and talk about it and attempt to do something together about it, like we have done in this time period with the Stamp Act Congress. All right, even more resistance. The Sons of Liberty will be formed by Samuel Adams, and the point of this is to enforce non-importation agreements against violators. So a group of people, especially in Boston, would essentially force and bully other colonists into not buying British goods. And they would do that by intimidating them, but also by attacking the British officials selling goods or enforcing navigation laws or mercantilist laws through the act of tar and feathering, and as you can see in this artist's rendition as well, also pouring steaming hot tea down British officials' throats, which is super painful and dangerous. Other things that the Sons of Liberty did, the houses of unpopular British officials were ransacked, their stuff would be stolen, they would hang them in effigy, meaning that they'd take like a dummy and like write their name on it and burn it and hang it as like a sign of we're coming for you. They would harass them. The stamps that they had, they would burn them. The warehouses where stamps were stored, they would burn down or destroy. And essentially, they intimidate the Stamp Act agents so much that many of them resign, stop doing their job, and no one can buy any stamps because no one's selling any stamps because everyone's afraid of the Sons of Liberty in Boston, which is fantastic. Essentially, these tactics, the Virginia Resolve, Stamp Act Congress, Sons of Liberty, violence, are effective because a year later, 1766, the Stamp Act is going to be repealed because people in Parliament see it as a possible cause of civil crisis. They were right. And so they encourage British merchants who are trying to trade in the New World to write to Parliament and say, hey, this is not working in the colonies. We've seen it firsthand. And with the repealing of the Stamp Act, Great Britain will also lower a Sugar Act tax and pass the Declaratory Act, which is the best thing ever. And the idea is essentially to save face, to make it look like, oh, well, we repealed it because we want to. It claims that Parliament has the right to tax colonists in the future. They just decided to stop with the Stamp Act of their own accord. So just when you thought it's about to get better relationships between Britain and the colonies, you are wrong. Great Britain will ruin it again, this time with the Townshend Acts. There he is in all his lovely chubby cheekness. Charles Townshend, he is going to be a chancellor in Parliament, and essentially he's going to take control of the British Parliament in order to punish the colonies for the Stamp Act uproar. The provisions of the Stamp Act is import taxes on glass, on lead, paper, paint, silk, and tea. So everyday goods, things that they'd be buying constantly from England. And it is an indirect customs tax. It is an external tax, what they were talking for, what they said Parliament had the right to enforce. However, the revenue raised from the tax would go straight into the paychecks of royal governors in the colonies and judges of the Vice Admiralty courts. And it also established a board of customs and more Vice Admiralty courts to enforce trade laws. And these royal judges and paid through the tax from the Townshend Acts would be able to enforce the laws better and grant more writs of assistance. Remember, that means the British officials have the right to just search and seize anything in private homes, private shops, private warehouses. So just when the nightmare of the Stamp Act ends, we're going to get the uproar from the Townshend Acts. And thus more chaos continues because of the Townshend Acts. First, we're going to see colonies interpreting this as a tax to raise revenue and saying that in any form, raising revenue just to raise revenue is inappropriate. You're not putting this towards something that we need or something that is essential in the colonies. No, you're putting it forth for people that we don't want, the judges of the Vice Admiralty courts and the royal governors. So in Massachusetts, urged on by Samuel Adams, a part of the Sons of Liberty, the Massachusetts Circular Letter is going to be written, and essentially it argues that all other colonies should listen to them and pass petitions to repeal the act. In response to this, British officials in Parliament will send troops to Boston and threaten to dissolve any colonial assembly or legislature that passes a Massachusetts Circular Letter idea, a petition. We're going to see in response to that, a lot of colonies reenact their non-importation agreements and say, oh, okay, if this is how you're going to act, then we're not going to buy your crap. And so 40% of British exports will not be bought. So British exports are going to fall over 40% in the next 4 months. Not 4 months, in the next few months, meaning that these non-importation agreements are working. Colonies are saying, we're not going to deal with this. We're just not going to buy your junk if you're going to act like this. And so, actually, a lot of colonies, Massachusetts, Maryland, Virginia, Delaware, and South Carolina, are all going to support the Massachusetts Circular Letter and pass it through their colonial legislature, meaning that technically, legally, their assembly did not exist anymore, because the Townsend Act, the response to Massachusetts Circular Letter was, if your colonial assembly passes this, then we're going to dissolve you. But they continued to meet anyway. So Boston is where the action is going to continue to happen. We are in March 1770. We have peaceful arrival of troops, a standing army in Boston, but they're going to arouse this American resistance and this idea of, why are they here? Why are we having to pay for them and quarter them? And why are we getting taxed when we don't even want their protection? So the colonists are fearful of these standing armies because they think that Britain is suppressing their liberties through the idea of an army there intimidating you. So British soldiers are hanging out on a street in Boston. We have colonists that are likely coming home a little bit drunk from a bar, from a saloon, I guess, and they start harassing the British officials and throwing snowballs and rocks and sticks. And eventually, having been provoked, the British soldiers fire on that rioting crowd in Boston. 11 innocents are wounded, and 5 of those will die. And one of them is Crispus Attucks. He is mulatto, so he is white and he's a mix, white and black. He's a merchant seaman, and some people point to him as the first to die in the Revolution. And apparently, he was the leader of the unruly mob. So, just very telling that a freed black was one of the first to die for American independence here. The colonists will take this idea that, oh, we were massacred, and run with it. It will be printed as propaganda, spreading throughout the colonies, especially by the Sons of Liberty, to essentially exaggerate the event and make the British look like they did it. And so if you look at this print right here, sometimes it was printed in black and white, sometimes in color. This is a print by Paul Revere, actually drew this. And it looks like the British soldiers are at fault and they're firing upon innocent colonists. That's not at all how it happened, but that is how the colonial leaders and the Sons of Liberty are going to make it look, to inspire hatred against the British. Okay? So this massive uproar, they saw it with the Stamp Act, and now we're seeing it again with the Townsend Acts. The Townsend Acts are going to be repealed. Lord North, a new leader in Parliament, is going to bow to this pressure, gets the acts repealed in 1770 because those non-importation agreements were hurting British manufacturers. They're pinching them to where they can't really sell anything in the colonies anymore. However, they're going to keep a tax, a 3-penny tax on tea, in order to demonstrate that Parliament still has the right to tax. So we're going to keep a tax on this tea, and they're going to remove a bunch of the troops in Boston. And the general feeling of relations between Great Britain and the colonies will improve after the Townsend Acts are repealed. So after the Boston Massacre, from 1770 to 1773, there's this period of there's not that much rebellion. Things are going pretty good in the colonies, and the relationship is improving. And the Gaspee incident in 1771 is the only one time where there's major uproar over the relationship between the two. So the British warship, the Gaspee, is in Providence, Rhode Island, and it runs aground accidentally while pursuing smugglers. And the ship was just notorious for really benefiting the British and really hurting colonial merchants and traders, and allowing the British to steal things from the colonial merchants and traders off their ships. And when it runs aground, the Sons of Liberty hear about it. They go to Rhode Island, and they will take the crew off the ship dressed as natives. That's their signature. Take the crew off the ship and set it on fire. But the commander of the Gaspee is wounded. And so when they hear tale of this in Parliament, there are many lords in the House of Lords who essentially want to seek retribution and get revenge on the guilty parties for the Gaspee incident. But they're unable to find the guilty parties because they dressed up like natives, and it's the Sons of Liberty, and they're super tricky. So during this 3-year period of relative peace, we're going to see leaders like Sam Adams who are extremely still infuriated at the idea of taxation without representation and British cracking down on these navigation laws, try and keep up the resistance. And so they'll do so through committees of correspondence. Essentially, it is letter writing to spread propaganda. So in particular, intercolonial committees of correspondence, they're delegates that come together and write about the things that are happening in their colony and send it to another colonial assembly. And the letters will be passed around, inspiring resistance against the British and keeping that fervor alive. And these committees of correspondence will eventually evolve into little mini congresses that will congregate and talk about bad things that are happening at the hands of the British in the colony. So that 3-year period, 1770 to 1773, of relative peace between British and colonial relations is going to get wrecked again by the Tea Act. So the Tea Act is 1773, and the Tea Act takes the British East India Company, the BEI is what I've written on your screen, British East India Company, and gives them right to sell tea in the colonies exclusively. So it creates a monopoly, keeping all other tea from all other countries and all other manufacturers out of the colonies, and putting a tax on top of it. So you can only buy British East India Company tea, and there's a 3-pence tax on it. But here's the thing, it makes it cheaper than buying from a different country or from a different company who might charge you more. But colonists are still angry. They see the Tea Act as a sneaky attempt to trick the colonies to accept the tax through cheaper tea. So they recognize that the Great Britain is scheming against them to say, oh, well, you're paying less for it, and it has a tax on top of it. They don't fly with that. So the Sons of Liberty will act again in Boston. This is December 16th, 1773. They will essentially dress up as Mohawken natives, board 3 British ships in Boston Harbor, and dump 342 chests open into the harbor, losing Great Britain in today's money millions of dollars. And they will, this act alone will cause Great Britain to react very violently towards the colonies through the Intolerable Acts. So the Intolerable Acts have a few names: Intolerable Acts, Coercive Acts, or Repressive Acts. Technically, they're called the Coercive Acts, but the colonists start calling them the Intolerable Acts because they literally cannot tolerate them. They are intolerable. And the goal of them is to punish the British colonists, and especially Boston. So there are a few different acts that we lump together and call them the Intolerable Acts. The first is the Boston Port Act. It closed Boston Harbor and said no more exporting, no more going through Boston Harbor, no more importing, no more trading in Boston Harbor until the damages were paid for and order was restored. It took away the Massachusetts Charter as its own independent colony. This is the Massachusetts Government Act. And it essentially said the king has the power to appoint the governor and the governor's counselor. And so essentially it takes away colonial assembly completely. It takes away town meetings completely. The Administration of Justice Act, it says that British soldiers who are accused of hurting or harassing or killing colonists now get to go to England to have their trial. And if they go to England to have their trial, they're definitely going to get let off. And the Quartering Act. The Quartering Act said that once again you must house and feed and pay for British soldiers within Boston. And finally, the Quebec Act. It's not intended to punish the colonies, but because it gets lumped in with the Intolerable and Coercive Acts, the colonists will see it as despicable. So essentially, the French in Canada, they're allowed to practice Catholicism, even though Great Britain owns their land, and the Quebec territory is extended a little bit more. The French are allowed to keep their old customs, institutions, French culture, and government. And to the French, they're getting a pretty good deal. To the colonists, they see it as an idea to create a French Canada and like inspire a threat to the colonists. Like, oh, we're giving them these rights. If you would just behave, you would get these rights as well. Whereas the colonists think, we already have these rights and you're infringing on them with your taxes. All right, so how will the colonists react to the intolerable and coercive acts? Here's what they do. The First Continental Congress will go down in U.S. history as the beginning of the revolution here. So the committees of correspondence that we had going, where they're always writing to each other, always updating each other about what's going on in their colonies when it comes to British and colonist relationship. These committees will start writing letters urging the colonies to act quickly and to send people to unite. So Bostonians will invite other colonies to come together, and essentially the First Continental Congress will occur from September to October in fall 1774. And we'll have every colony except Georgia represented with some delegates. The first step here, many of them endorse the resolutions called the Suffolk Resolves. And the Suffolk Resolves is basically like, why are we here? This is what we're doing. We are denouncing the intolerable acts. We are saying we're not putting up with them. We're going to organize a militia for defensive purposes, not fighting back, just defending ourselves. We're going to try and suspend all trade with the rest of the British Empire, not just England itself, but the East India Company and all of the other parts of the British Empire. And we're going to urge citizens to not pay their British taxes, try and like hit them where it hurts. The main purpose of the First Continental Congress, of course, is to petition for Parliament to listen to them and the king to listen to them. And so they will pass a bill called Declaration and Resolves. It's italicized there on your screen. And it says, we colonists have the legal right to assemble, to come together and ask for a redress of the acts that you have put on us, for you to revisit them and listen to our petition here. And essentially, this declaration is a precursor to our Declaration of Independence because it sets up the structure of it. We have a preamble, which lists what we're doing. It has grievances, which is the things that you're doing that we don't like, and a mutual pledge. And here's the mutual pledge of the Declaration and Resolves. It is not a Declaration of Independence. It says, please do these things because we're still loyal to you. We still want to be part of the British Empire. One thing that comes from the First Continental Congress is the coolest named thing ever, the Association. The Association is essentially the most significant act of the Congress. It is a body of delegates that come together and push for complete boycott of British goods. Non-importation, we're not buying any of their things. Non-exportation, we're not selling them anything. And non-consumption, anything that's in the colonies that belongs to the British, we could possibly buy here, we're not going to. Instead, we're going to make our own tea. We're going to make our own cloth. We're going to make our own fur fashions, okay? And yet, despite all this, the First Continental Congress, no matter how revolutionary it sounds, they still say, dude, we're still loyal to you. Can you just fix some things within your empire? They have no real desire to be independent yet. They just want their grievances addressed at this point. And so a convention, the Continental Congress, all this stuff is passed. They meet again, not the Second Continental Congress, but in Virginia, they're approving the proceedings of the First Continental Congress. That's when Patrick Henry gives his "give me liberty or give me death" speech. But the king and Parliament, they don't respond to the Declaration Resolves. And actually, the reason that historians believe that the king did not respond to it was if he did, then he would be legitimizing the colonists' right to assemble and complain. And he didn't want to do that. And that is going to be kind of the straw that breaks the camel's back. Because, yes, they weren't legitimized, but the king didn't respond to them. So they have to do something else in order to get their grievances looked at. Okay? So this is what leads us to the shot heard around the world, the Battle of Lexington and Concord, the first battle of the Revolutionary War. Essentially, Parliament orders General Gage, who's governor of Massachusetts, to arrest any leaders of the rebellion and to prepare the military in Boston to fight. So in April 1775, 700 British redcoats are sent to go to Lexington and Concord to take their armaments, to seize their gunpowder and their weapons, and to arrest Samuel Adams and John Hancock, who were part of the Sons of Liberty and also big players at the Continental Congress. But this is where we get the Paul Revere, William Dawes, and Samuel Prescott riding in the middle of the night, not yelling, "The British are coming, the British are coming," but secretly spreading the word throughout the countryside that the regulars were coming. And it was a secret. Two of them will be stopped and arrested and rerouted, and they finally make it to Lexington and Concord. So essentially, once the British troops get to Lexington and Concord, the secret's out. Paul Revere, William Dawes, and Samuel Prescott have done their job. Lexington and Concord are aware. They get there, the British troops get there, and the arsenal is completely depleted, and there's American Minutemen there waiting for them, so a colonist militia. And no one really knows how the skirmish began on the Lexington Green, so like a park area there, but they meet there, and the first shots of the Revolution are fired. 8 Americans killed, 10 are wounded. No one knows who fires the first shot. Could have been an accident because they have very inaccurate weapons at this point in history. And the redcoats kind of go around the colonists and flee towards Concord, 6 miles away. At Concord, the British are forced to retreat again by American reinforcements who had been tipped off by Paul Revere. And the militia members are kind of like picking off British soldiers as they run away. By the end of the day, there are 273 British soldiers dead and 95 Americans dead. And Minutemen outside the city, outside Lexington and Concord, will travel to Boston and lay siege to Boston, chasing the redcoats out. And that is our first battle of the Revolutionary War. So moving forward, let's look at, here's Paul Revere. I personally think he looks a lot like Jack Black, so that's why I put that on there. Paul Revere was actually a pretty rich silversmith, and you can buy Paul Revere silver pieces, and they're worth hundreds of thousands of dollars now just because of this midnight ride of Paul Revere, and he will be honored in a poem by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow that's kind of historically accurate. We're going to look at it in class. All right, so who's going to win this battle? Looking from the beginning, it doesn't look great for the colonists because the British strengths way outweigh colonist strengths. There's so much more population in the British Empire when you take out the colonies. So 7.5 million people living in England and the English colonies, with the exception of the 13 original colonies, and 2.5 million for the colonies themselves. Essentially, Great Britain has a lot more money and a bigger navy as well. So they have a big monetary advantage and one of the best navies in the world that has crushed numerous other countries' navies. We will see about 20,000 slaves in the Carolinas and Georgia, the Deep South, who joined the British because the British promised them freedom if they fought for the British cause. And many after the war will flee with the British as well, but that's a small number. Natives are going to side with the British because the British promised to protect them, and also natives don't like colonists trying to spread into the frontier in the western parts. The British also possess a professional army with professional weapons, professional uniforms, and professional training. The British will hire German Hessians who are extremely violent mercenaries sent to kill in the British Army, and they will have them train their military as well. And also they have about 50,000 loyalists in the colonies who want to remain part of the British Empire, helping them. So on the weakness side, essentially they got a long route to get here. The distance and lack of communication between Parliament, the Crown, and the Army and Navy is going to be very difficult, whereas in the colonies it's much closer to the colonial Continental Congress and things like that. They do not have the home field advantage here. It's a very large region for Britain's army to effectively occupy, and the population was pretty dispersed. They don't have that many great leaders as the colonists will have. Many British soldiers are unwilling to kill their American cousins, essentially. They see them as British as well. France is going to be knocking on America's door saying, oh, psst, colonists, we don't like the British, we can help you. So France wants its revenge on England, and the Whig party in England that are vying for checking the power of the king are definitely cheering on American victories. All right, what does America have on their side? George Washington. George Washington, Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin's a diplomat at this point, and George Washington is a military leader, a veteran from the French and Indian War. Great leaders, great colonial delegates that are going to be leading the fight and leading the diplomacy of the American Revolution. They're also going to get economic aid from France at the outset of the war, and later on, France is going to send military aid in the form of troops and weapons as well. They're also just defending. It's harder to be on the offense than it is on the defense in war, and so their military tactics are going to work to their advantage, and the fact that they are in a land that they know of and that they're useful, like a home field advantage, is on their side as well. They can feed themselves. For British troops, they had to either find things, grow things, or depend on Great Britain to send them food, whereas in the colonies, they're self-sustaining. Farms are close by. They could feed themselves. Colonials were better marksmen in the idea of like sniping British officials as well, and they don't really go for the official we stand in lines and shoot each other and charge at one point. They're more like picking British generals off from behind and sneak attacks and things like that. So even though militarily they're not as well trained, they're going to be better marksmen, and they'll have the Kentucky long rifle, which we'll talk about next time. And they kind of have a moral advantage from belief in their just cause. We don't like the British. We're fighting against them, and that is our cause that's going to get us through this revolution. So as far as their weaknesses, it's a pretty long list. They're badly organized. They lack unity from the beginning. The Continental Congress, even though it's great and they have great leaders, they're kind of weak and ineffective because the regional differences of the North, Middle, and South get in the way. They don't have a constitution in the beginning when they break away, which is a big problem. The colonies themselves see them as, oh, I am Virginia. Oh, I am Delaware. Oh, I am Rhode Island. They don't see themselves as unified very often, and thus we get a lot of infighting and jealousy. They have economic difficulties where Great Britain had depleted them of their hard money, their gold and silver. They just have a lot of paper currency. And so individual colonies are printing paper currency, but that leads to a depleting of the value of the money and inflation. They don't have as many military supplies, and a lot of their military supplies are handmade bullets and things like that. So those inadequate military supplies and firearms and gunpowder and the militiamen themselves are kind of unreliable. And essentially the Minutemen, they're not part of a paid militia. They're volunteers. And yes, we'll get to a point where they will be paid, but excuse me. Essentially, they can quit at any time. They can desert at any time if they don't feel like they need to fight for the cause anymore, which is going to cause a lot of problems for George Washington at Valley Forge. All right, so next lecture is going to be the actual American Revolution itself, and we're going to see these strengths and weaknesses play out in the battle for our independence. Thanks for listening.